All right. Well, thank you to each one of our presenters. Uh, and we now have some time. This on? Yeah. Okay. So we now have a few minutes for discussion and with the audience, so we can entertain some questions. I think so. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Oh, yeah. What? Oh, yes. My name is Esteban Perez Caldente, and I work for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean based in Santiago, Chile. I have a couple of questions for Jerry and a couple of questions for Jan. With Jerry, I have the following questions. You talked about the Federal Reserve swap lines. When I've looked at the Federal Reserve swap lines and I looked at who gets those swap lines, it seems that it's quite related to the holding of United States Treasury bills. And is it a way really to control or avoid interference with US monetary policy, in the sense that 25% of US Treasury bills are held outside the US and central banks can dump these Treasury bills in the market for dollars in order to have the liquidity they need? And the second question is regarding the importance of the bond market. After the global financial crisis, the banks lost importance in terms of lending, cross-border lending, and the bond market, international bond market, has really increased its importance. And what I've seen is that the impact of US interest rate changes is much more intense with the bond market than through cross-border lending. The question I have for Jan is, you talked about Kaleski and Schumacher and Keynes. Now, Kaleski and Schumacher criticized Keynes. And one of the criticisms they made is instead of using, for example, the current account to sort of evaluate what's your imbalance, to use the basic balance. Can you just tell us what your opinion on that is? Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That was an absolutely fascinating session. So to both Jerry and Jan, in a sense, I mean, Jerry, you were kind of emphasizing what Kindleberger had said, right? Money is about power, international money is about international power. And in a way, what you're also saying is that the architecture of it is kind of cementing that power. So one question would be, the kinds of clearing systems that you were talking about, Jan, are really those where you're kind of abstracting from power. You're kind of saying that there's going to be this group of well-meaning people. I think they thought of them as men, but whoever, are going to sort out the way in which you can actually deal with this. Can you even think of, I mean, I don't know the site you mentioned, that global, can you think of it at all without power? And then the question is, if it's all about international power, and we know that that is not static, that that's really changing, the globe is changing dramatically. Yes, you're putting in place systems or you're engaging in transactions that perhaps help you to cement that power, but there are lots of counterbalancing forces, right? And one of the things you didn't mention is the emergence of the whole other financial network that has happened after the Ukraine war, post the sanctions on Russia. The fact that people have got around SWIFT, that countries are dealing with other types of clearing systems that no longer rely on a very Western-based system. And the other kinds of exchange rate swaps, the RMB swaps and so on, that you're right, in volume terms they're small, but more and more other countries are using those. And then that brings me to Danny, which is that, the final bit you mentioned, I take everything you said in that final slide. I agree with everything except that one bit where you say that in a way that, development doesn't require industrialization anymore. Because if you think about industrial policy today in the US, IRA or EU, everything, it is, yes, it is a response to China, but it's also a response in terms of controlling the key technologies of the future, right? Or what are seen to be the key technologies. So a lot of the, I mean, whether it's CHIPS Act or IRA, it's all designed to make sure that you're not losing in that technology game. I don't think other developing countries can just sit back and say, oh, they're going to do it and then solve the problem for the rest of the world. So you have to industrialize also because increasingly access to technology is going to determine even whether you can do the services. Otherwise, you'll be stuck in low-grade services forever. And India made that mistake, right? We said, okay, we don't need manufacturing, we can do services, and that has not helped. So I'm just wondering about that particular recommendation.
Thank you very much. Again, excellent presentation. We are on for a very good treat for 3 days. My first one is to repeat the question by Jayati to Danny, and he knows the question. We talked about it. I'm very concerned about the idea of de-emphasizing industrialization, especially for developing countries. It simply does not work. Services are very, very informal, low-paying jobs, and very low productivity, very low tech. I don't see that as a possible way out. Then the issue of the middle class, I think, should also be emphasized for not just for it's not an advanced country issue, but it's also everybody's issue, including so the issue of the middle class concerns every country, including developing countries, and we can elaborate on that. The issue of reserve holdings, one thing is that most countries hold the reserve in dollars, but from a central banker's perspective, there is the concern about safety of the assets, and that's probably why they think it's a better way to hold reserves. I don't know what you would have to say about that. For Jerry, do you think regional monetary unions could be another way of reducing the dominance of reserves? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, this is a question to Danny. You know, there seems to be an asymmetry here. There's a global problem, which is climate, etc. There's the problem of poverty reduction in the developing countries or in the South. And the problem in the developed countries is merely strengthening the middle class. Because if you look at, after the golden age, there's been a slowdown in growth. There's been a huge increase in inequality, of course, which brings them. But it also is the rise to dominance of finance, that you're in a world in which you actually cannot ensure the possibility of any challenge being reasonably addressed because of the power of finance. So reducing the crisis in the developed countries to merely one of having to address the problem, strengthening the middle class, might perhaps be letting the developed countries off.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. Just a question also following up on the future of industrialization for the developing world, but also the role for development banks, either multilateral or in-country development banks, which also went out of fashion with saying that you don't need industrial policies, and what you think of the future of development banks in developing countries.
My name is Shovik. I'm a researcher at PERI. My question is to Danny. When you mentioned about the low labor absorbing capacity of the newer investments being happening, one thing I was thinking of, yes, the labor absorbing capacity over the years have come down. But across the technologies, it seems like the research which has been done by us at PERI and by Robert Paulin and others, it shows that the labor-absorbing capacity of these renewable energy technologies or these climate investments are are way above than the fossil fuel, the existing technologies. So I was just thinking, and another article which recently came out, which showed that this investments being made in CHIPS IRA has been a huge contributor to this employment generating process now in the US, which we see the unemployment rate being high, which also is a kind of projection that jobs will go up, and which we see also in our study. So why do you think, in that sense, the labor absorbing capacity of these technologies are low? And one question for Jerry, in the pie chart which you showed, it seems that the US has a very high foreign exchange reserve capacity. So I was confused about the numbers. I think it would be around 48 instead of 88, probably. I just wanted to check with you. And do you think that in the last slide here, it's interesting, do you think the spatial drawing rights of the IMF can play a role, which I know many of here has written about, that they can help the developing countries in the financing of these investment projects? Thank you.
Thank you very much for 3 interesting presentations. My question was, my name is Georgie Chikata, and I'm from SOAS, University of London. My question also goes to Danny. Like others, I was very challenged by this idea that industrialization was something to be jettisoned, because this is a big discussion going on in Africa today. All of the AU, all African countries are talking about structural transformation, basically to get out of this primary commodities exports trap. So I was glad that several people mentioned it. But I thought that one of the biggest global problems is about the crisis in the world of work, the casualization of work, 0-hour contracts. Basically, this is something which unites the global north and south. And so it goes beyond dealing with global poverty. And I wondered what you thought about this issue about work and the future of work.
My name is Charles Abugri from Ideas. I was struck by all 3 panelists making absolutely zero reference to the changing geopolitical context, especially war drums beating in all parts of the world. The war in Europe, the war in the Middle East, the wars that are being stroked also in Southeast Asia. I was wondering, starting from Danny, whether your assessment is that these changes happening in geopolitics are probably not significant enough to alter fundamentally the global economy. And maybe that, if that is the case, can you explain why? If not, is there a prospect, hearing from say, the response of the European Union and changes in the European economy about the need to reorient economies towards producing for the war, basically, whether that have a potential impact on industrial policy among the Euro-American alliances, and if that will could eventually influence the nature of economies and structures in the North and the prospects and potential for industrialization and industrial policy in the global south?
You guys have
Okay, I've been tasked with going first. Thank you very much for all these very interesting questions. I'm going to talk briefly if I can, because there's a lot of discussion to be had. Let me start with Jayati's questions about power and alternative financial arrangements. Yes, power, I agree, is key to the operations of the international system, including the international monetary and financial system. And given the discussion about changes in the geopolitical structures in the world economy, yes, there has been rising of alternative financial markets, alternative swap lines, and so forth, related mostly to China, but not entirely to China, I think. And as I mentioned, one of my possible scenarios is developing countries and emerging market economies aligning themselves more with a non-U.S. led regime, including led by the Chinese, is the most likely. And that's certainly one of the alternatives. The currently existing alternative, with the swap lines and so forth, are very small. And they really operate to the extent that the dollar is not connected directly to the transactions. It's not the dollar funding isn't the underlying funding that's being hedged and so forth. As long as much of the world's finance coming into developing countries and emerging market countries are either from Europe or the United States, from pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and so forth, as long as they're denominated in dollars or in euros, it's going to be very difficult for these other alternative swap arrangements and other hedging arrangements to exclude those markets entirely. So the question is getting more finance from different sources. And then you can have different intermediaries. So for example, local development banks or the SDR, I think we need to liberate the SDR. When the Federal Reserve gives a swap line, they're actually creating money because there's no offsetting liability. It's actually adding to the money in the system, and it's being used to bail out this Wall Street complex, as Daniela Gabor refers to it. But instead, it could be used through the SDR to finance dealing with climate change and other things. So I think we need to move more in that direction. There were some questions about where the swap lines and the repo market facilities are really to help make U.S. monetary policy more effective. And clearly that's one of the goals of the Fed in doing this, and it is having that impact. The question I have is that a good thing? Do we really want to make U.S. monetary policy more effective around the world, or do we want to have a more shared responsibility for global monetary policy? Hi, Jomo. Sorry,
Jomo, unfortunately, Jomo had a fall and has a hurt leg, and he's stuck in New York. So he's come all the way from Malaysia, but he's in New York and watching us online. But his question is it is difficult to see any of the proposed scenarios materializing in the context of the new geopolitics, as Charles has emphasized. Also, why should the world be held ransom to the whims of Fed policy, as Merling proposes? So it's directly relating to what you just said.
I think I'll move. There are some other questions, but I think we're really kind of short of time, so let me let some other people speak here.
I hate to hear that we're short of time. Andrew Sheng's comment about the effectiveness of U.S. monetary policy comes to mind, and that is the success of the Great Moderation. The success of the Great Moderation was the result of adding 200 million Chinese workers to the global labor force. And the question I'd like to raise, or what I tried to raise, is that what would be the impact if those 200 million Chinese workers had come to the United States to join the international labor force? And what would then happen to the effectiveness of U.S. monetary policy? I don't know the answer, but this is one of the questions that I think we do have in front of us. Whenever you do to the argument about the terms of trade, you always pull out of your back pocket manufacturing as resolving the problem of primary commodity producing countries. Keith Griffin, bless his heart, has done a whole lot of research on this and shows that, in fact, in general, manufacturing doesn't solve that problem. But the point is that even if it did, it's not manufacturing that's the point. The point is the technical progress that's associated with manufacturing. And technical progress, just like capital and labor, used to be immobile, and it's not anymore. So that the response to the industrialization problem, I think, is looking back at the old, the idea of the flying geese. China employed the flying geese very effectively, and I can see no reason why most other developing countries can't continue to do that. And as we know, the flying geese always progress, and technical progress progresses. So, everybody doesn't have to go back to producing Barbie dolls in order to start out the industrialization process in that particular context. The last point, and this relates, I think, to political control and everything else. When I normally do this presentation at the end with clearing systems, the first point is that the clearing system was set up in a particular political context and was done to solve a particular political problem. Keynes started his work in the 1920s, and that work in the 1920s was on ancient money. And we know that that work was associated with the work of Luigi Einaudi, and it was also associated with the work of Adam Smith. If you look for this concept that Keynes used in the treatise of bank money, Adam Smith talks about bank money, okay? Even William Petty talks about bank money. Bank money is what? Bank money is the banker sitting in front of his balance sheets and debiting and crediting. That is a clearing system, okay? Now, there is a very good explanation and a very good historical background to argue that all financial systems are clearing systems. Every financial system started out as a clearing system. So if you look, and this now comes to Esteban's question, if you look at this sort of system, the system that was set up by one in which you had particular national borders, you had national boundaries, you had a problem that had to be solved. A clearing system in the current technology is what? Well, my response to this is, let's take the turn, do the corner of history. If the central banks do central bank, okay, digital accounts, and if those are retail accounts, the first question you ask yourself, and you say, why do we need a central bank? Because our central bank in the United States is a reserve bank. It provides reserves to banks because there's a risk associated to the liabilities that they issue. If the central bank is issuing the liabilities, then there is no risk. Why does the central bank need to keep reserves? Why do we need the central bank? Couldn't the U.S. Treasury do this just as easily? And in fact, when the Federal Reserve was set up, there was a question of whether or not the monetary function should have been situated in the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. Treasury can very easily run a set of retail digital transaction accounts. Now, if you have those retail digital transaction accounts, central bank disappears. Also, what disappears, and this is the logic of Shoemaker's eventual proposal, not the criticism of the original plan, but his own proposal, That is, as long as you have these accounts going back and forth, who cares about the external account? Who cares whether it's the terms of trade that affects the balance of trade, or whether it's the basic balance, or whether it's everything else? Every cross-border transaction is a P2P transaction, which takes place amongst individuals. Those individuals presumably are very happy in engaging in those transactions without having to go to their local banker, without the local banker having to go to their central bank in order to effectuate that transaction. So all of this stuff which causes us difficulties disappears. Okay? You have a system in which people freely trade across borders. If I want to buy something in euro, I can buy something in euro. I agree with my counterparty. I'm going to give an account in dollars. You're going to give an account in euro. This goes into the clearing system. The clearing system debits one, credits the other, and the game is over. Okay? So the problem, as I said before, is thinking of ways in which you can sort of get around these constraints that we've imposed on the system, which in fact are no longer relevant because those borders simply don't count. People go across borders, technology goes across borders, information goes across borders, and we keep butting our heads up against this problem is that we've set up these, what are institutional constraints that create difficulties that effectively we could resolve with the kinds of technology that we currently have available.
Yeah, I understand the resistance on my pessimism on industrialization. First, let me be clear that I'm not writing off industrialization. I'm just saying that it's not going to be the driving source of growth. That we need to pay attention to services. And let me be very clear that this is an argument not about the desirability of industrialization, but the feasibility of industrialization. I did a lot of my work, emphasizing how important industrialization manufacturing has been in driving very rapid growth for a variety of reasons. And I've been driven to the view that this strategy is no longer feasible because of changes in technology, the nature of global markets. Today, except for certain garments and essentially iPhone assembly, which still remains labor intensive, manufacturing has essentially become of a very different nature in terms of its labor absorption capacity. I mean, you see this all over the world. Somebody mentioned the United States, perhaps this investments in chips and IRA might be creating jobs. That literally is not happening. I mean, you look at the numbers. The share of manufacturing employment in the United States is lower today than it was when Biden took office. And so that continues to decline regardless of investment in manufacturing and the capacity. I mean, sort of a couple of weeks ago, there was an announcement of the big plant, TSMC plant in Arizona. So this is going to be a total of $65 billion of investment in Arizona that TSMC is making. $65 billion. They're receiving $6 billion of grant under CHIPS from the federal government. How many jobs is that going to create? 6,000. That's about $10 million per jobs. But it's also the same in the rest of the world. I mean, the only countries in the world where manufacturing employment are actually increasing as a share of total employment, if you look at where the source of expansion of manufacturing is essentially highly informal. Somebody mentioned petty services and sort of low productivity, but where employment is increasing in the low and middle income countries, in the few cases that it is increasing in these highly unproductive, informal activities. So the reality today is that if you want to sort of compete in manufacturing, integrate into the global value chains, you have to use very skill-intensive, capital-intensive technologies. You sort of, even if you're successful, you occupy a narrow segment of the supply chain, and the labor absorption capacity tends to be very, very low. The alternative, of course, is you can go back to 1950s style import substitution, put very high trade barriers, adopt very sort of out-of-date technologies, maybe, but that's not, I don't think, what people have in mind when they talk about industrialization. there is a sort of, the geese, sort of the flying geese models, but literally today there is only one goose. That's Vietnam. Nobody else has been doing this that I'm aware of. So when I say services, it's not because I like that, but it's because I just don't see where else the productive jobs are going to come from. And I think the point that was been made that as currently constituted, most services in developing countries are petty, informal, very low productivity. That is absolutely true. But that's why I think it's essential to reorient development thinking about how we can actually create increase the productivity of jobs in the services, because whether we like it or not, the bulk of the jobs in the developing countries are going to be in services. Now, the good news there is that there is a variety of strategies that are available in terms of increasing productivity in services. Part of it is driven by improvements in firm capacities, training, entrepreneurship, provision of particular public inputs. Part of it is driven through provision of technology. So there is a variety of different ways that this can be done, but it's not going to happen if developing countries still see export-oriented industrialization as their main growth vehicle. Now, what does this shift in focus from industrialization and manufacturing to services mean in terms of growth? It definitely lowers the growth envelope. That is, that you cannot grow as rapidly based on services as you could with export-oriented industrialization, because it's going to be mainly driven by the growth of domestic demand. Increasing productivity in services is much harder than increasing productivity in manufacturing. So there are all these disadvantages. There's one silver lining. The silver lining is that it ends up being a much more inclusive model of growth, because you're creating jobs precisely for the kind of the poorer, lower middle class people. And therefore, it's essentially, as somebody raised, what about the middle class in the developing countries? A services-based job would be a middle class-oriented development strategy for the developing countries. In fact, it would depend on the creation of a middle class, because you want to expand domestic demand as you expand productivity in these services. So it is not a conclusion that I reach sort of lightly. I think it has significant implications for the growth potential, but on the way that the global markets and technologies are structured today, I just don't see where the jobs in manufacturing are going to come from. Let me say just a couple of words on geopolitics and power and so forth. And I think Jayati is absolutely right that we need to pay more attention on power. And while on the one hand, sort of this whole new geopolitical reconfiguration and US-China competition is reshaping the world, I do think it's providing opportunities for middle powers, including sort of developing countries, to exercise much greater autonomy and much greater power in the world. I think they should use it. I don't think they should use it by simply going to the United States and saying we're going to be with China or we're going to be with Russia. I think they should use it by basically saying, well, we want a multipolar world. We don't want a world where the United States is the hegemon, or we don't want a world where the US, or for that matter China, tells us you have to choose either us or the other major power. I think countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, Turkey now have, and others have the power to sort of assert that and be self-conscious. I think and self-consciously do so. I think the big obstacle that they have to overcome in that is thinking more strategically as opposed to in transactional terms. I think a lot of what happens is that they're thinking about their role in the world economy in more transactional terms, in terms of short-term benefits. I think these countries also have the capacity to generate much more the kinds of technologies that are appropriate to their own needs. And this is where it also connects with the whole services-led development strategy, which is that I think, again, Jayat, you mentioned technology, importance of manufacturing and innovation. That's absolutely right. But it's not going to do a whole lot of job to focus on sort of high-end technologies or semiconductors in the advanced countries. What the developing countries really need are the kinds of technologies that are going to increase productivity in their labor-absorbing sectors. And countries like Brazil and South Africa and India do have now the technological capacity to invest in those kinds of technologies. But again, it's going to take a little bit of a shift in their frame of mind, I think. So let me just stop here.
Well, thank you to each one of our panelists. And this is, can you hear me? Okay. Okay. That's better. All right. Okay. Well, thank you for great presentations, and thank the audience for great questions. And we have a 15-minute break. So thank you.